Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jane McAdam and I'm the Director of the Caldwell Centre for International Refugee Law here at UNSW. And it's my very great pleasure to be able to welcome David Lubell to talk to us today. Before I introduce David, I'd of course like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge their elders past and present. David Lubell is the founder of Welcoming America, and he's been Executive Director of that organisation since October 2009. Welcoming America is an organisation that seeks to inspire people to build different kinds of communities. Inclusive communities that embrace immigrants and migrants and which foster and refugees and which foster inclusion and opportunity for all. Welcoming America is leading a movement of inclusive communities across the United States and shows how communities themselves can become more prosperous by making everybody who lives there feel like they belong. It connects a broad network of non-profit organisations and local governments so that together they can support people to develop plans, programs and policies that transform communities into vibrant places where people respect each other and where everybody's talents can be valued and cultivated. David's award-winning concept has gained recognition both nationally and internationally. In 2014, the UN Alliance of Civilizations and BMW Group named Welcoming America as one of the top 5 recipients worldwide of the Intercultural Innovation Award. This was to honour Welcoming America's work in promoting intercultural understanding. The White House has also honoured Welcoming America and 10 of its leaders as White House Welcoming America Champions of Change for their innovations in the area of immigrant integration. Welcoming America partners with the White House for its Building Welcoming Communities campaign. David has a Master's in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he was a Reynolds Social Entrepreneurship Fellow. David also holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and received a certificate in non-profit management. And in 2015, David was honoured by the World Economic Forum as a Young Global Leader. So David, we are really excited to hear from you today. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and Jane, thank you. Jane is also a Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum, and that's where we met. We met just a few months ago in Davos, actually. And we talked about becoming Australia, and now here I am. So thank you for welcoming me. I also want to thank the Caldwell Centre in general, including Francis, who makes all of this, makes it all happen. I also want to thank the Caldwellers who are here. So thank you to you for supporting this. And I have 2 special guests later on in the. I will introduce them later on, but they're just going to try to give a little bit more of the Australian context for this. But I will also give Australian context. So the organization, as Jane talked about, that I work for is Welcoming America. And Jane already described basically what we do. What that means, though, we like to be aspirational and talk about what we like to see in communities, which is inclusive places where everybody feels like they belong and are reaching their full potential. But also a welcoming community to us is not just a place that likes immigrants, although that's part of it, or refugees, or asylees, or there's lots of definitions that I've heard since I got here. But it's about a culture of welcome, and it's also about welcoming institutions. And so I'll talk more about that, but just so you know, we work in about 100+ communities in the United States, helping them do that. And I was asked to come to Australia by the Scanlon Foundation, who's starting a project called Welcoming Cities in Australia, which is based a lot on the work that we do in the United States. And they're working with an organization called Welcome to Australia to help make that happen. So that's just a little bit of background. One thing I said, we had a symposium in Melbourne a little while back, and one thing I said at the symposium was that it's important for us coming from another country here to say that we're not here, and we have a model that we've developed for immigrant and refugee integration in communities, but it was developed by trial and error, and it's not that everything's relevant or that we know everything, but we do have some ideas and lessons that we can share. And a lot of the people that, I've been on this trip, I've been to Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and seen the kind of work that they do around integrating refugees locally. I've even been to Bendigo and Shepparton and Hume. I've been all over. The folks at Scanlon definitely took me for a spin around the east part of this beautiful country. But yeah, that's all to say that there's a lot of amazing work happening on the local level around immigrant and refugee or migrant and refugee integration here. And so I look forward to sharing a lot of the lessons that we're doing with our groups in the United States. So now I'm going to tell you a story. Everybody likes stories. I like stories. This is a story of how the welcoming work began. And I'm telling you the story to provide a little context. It might not seem right away like there's relevance. We don't have quite as much anti-migrant sentiment, I would say, here. And of course, everybody's asking me about Donald Trump, so you can ask me about Donald Trump too, if you want later. But we were in a time actually of particular backlash against migrants in a part of the country in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was living in a place called, Nashville. I bet most of you have heard of it, the country music capital, Music City, USA. And Nashville in the late 90s had a large influx of migrants from economic migrants largely from Mexico and Latin America, but also a large number of refugees from northern Iraq, Kurdish refugees, and from Somalia and Sudan and all over the world. And so it was a very rapid change, and there was a backlash, unfortunately, that took place in the early 2000s. September 11th did not help with that backlash. There were other incidents that took place, small incidents that kind of raised fear even more. There was a drunk driving accident where a Mexican migrant killed a couple in a drunk driving accident. That sort of raised fear even more. Then an English-only referendum was introduced into the city council by some politicians who were starting to see that they could get some traction with this, saw that they could advance themselves politically by sort of peddling fear. And so that referendum happened, and then a mosque was burnt down to the ground in a community right near Nashville, and this was all part of this growing anti-immigrant sentiment. And here's a Nashville during that period, early to mid 2000s. The Nation is a magazine, and there's a picture of the mosque, a horrible incident. It was a hate crime. But Nashville was named the epicenter of the anti-immigrant movement in the United States by this magazine, by the Nation. And I was living there. I was running an organization called the Tennessee Immigrant Direct Rights Coalition, and I kind of agreed with them. It was not so good. But there's a happy ending, I'm happy to say. And so I, during this time, made a realization. And the realization was that my organization and other organizations in Nashville were not, we weren't addressing the root cause of some of the problems, of some of the backlash. So we were, if you think of migrants as seeds being put, or a refugee, immigrant, anybody from somewhere else, a newcomer, into a garden, we were pouring a lot of water on the seed. So English classes, job training, the things that you would do when you want to make sure someone's coming to your community, make sure they're successful, get them a house, or get them housing. But what we weren't doing was focusing on the soil. The soil was pretty barren, and there was nobody addressing that. So you have to help. What we found is that you have to help newcomers adjust, but you also have to help people who are already there adjust to the changes as well. Nobody was doing that, and so that was a big problem. And so we developed a method to try to change that. And the method was pretty simple, but it was focused on the soil. It was a method that involved contact, so bringing immigrants refugees together with their neighbors. That reduced a lot of fear, and we mobilized hundreds of volunteers across Nashville to do that. And when people started to have these conversations in communities, you could see the fear kind of turn off in their eyes, and like a more of a happy light come on when they saw, oh, this person actually shares my values, and it's not like what I was hearing on the news. This person wants the best for their community like I do. So that was important. And doing that at scale, even though it was in church basements and community centers, we did it everywhere because we had to. And then the next part was around communications. So we don't have. I've opted for having light so we can see each other versus like you being able to see every single detail of the slide. So sorry if you can't see it that well, but that's a group that was together in one of the community conversations that was taking place. Another piece that we developed was you can turn it off for now if you like. We'll turn it back on later. Just for these. So this is just a community conversation taking place. We also develop messages because a lot of in Nashville, and this happens in a lot of places, it's not natural. People who come, the 99.9% of the newcomer community that's trying to make a better life for themselves, for their family, and for their new communities, they're not telling their story to the rest of the community. They're just living their lives. And so people tend to hear about the 0.0001% of the community that might make their way to the nightly news, or not the people who are representative of the full community. And it creates this false image of what people are like. And so these are billboards, actually not from Nashville, but as we've grown, we've developed messages that with our local communities, a lot of different billboards and a lot of different types of social media advertising. And we work with the local media too. Every possible way that you can get these positive messages out, we use. These are just some examples. And so, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry, I don't want to give away the ending. So anyway, in Nashville, after a lot of work and a lot of effort, we did change the climate. We did change the soil. Basically, we knew that we were making a lot of progress because in 2009, there was a vote on that English-only referendum that I talked about. Would have made Nashville, only English for government services. It's bad, symbolically and everything else would have been bad for Nashville. But Nashville said, no, we're a welcoming city, and they voted. The people of Nashville voted overwhelmingly against the referendum and for being a welcoming city. And so we knew that the work we were doing was having traction, was making a difference. And so we kept moving forward, and we kept trying to push the envelope. And this is where it gets even more relevant for Australia, in my opinion. What we realized was that we could expand our definition of welcoming. We could expand it to mean not just that we had created a more welcoming culture, but how can we create, again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but how can we create institutions that were welcoming? And so, if you think of an immigrant or a refugee coming to Nashville, we thought about everything. Like if you're entrepreneurial by nature, but it's really hard to start a business in Nashville because of the linguistic barriers or because just of the red tape in general, that's lost opportunity for all of Nashville. And so we worked to create a plan, and this is what often doesn't happen in local communities. Often local communities will plan for recycling or plan for biking, but planning for people is less common. And so Nashville started to plan for people and think about, okay, if someone's arriving, how do we reduce all the barriers? And it wasn't just the city, we had all the sectors. We had the business community, we had the religious community, the labor, everybody at the table to come up with a plan for how Nashville could become really the most welcoming city in the region. And over time, it gained a reputation as being that, and as these policies were put into place, as the community started to embrace this idea, Nashville became really one of the most welcoming cities in the country, and definitely the most welcoming city in the southeast region. And this is where the second big light bulb came off. The first big light bulb was the seed in the soil thing that I talked about before. The second big light bulb was that it actually benefited everybody. So I was doing this work, I lived in Ecuador after college. I was welcomed by a family there. I learned Spanish. I had a very positive experience. And when I came back to the United States, I saw an unwelcoming, I was in Tennessee, and I saw an unwelcoming reception, and that made me ashamed, and it just I wasn't willing to accept that. But what happened was I was trying to help, and we were all trying to help migrants, refugees, but it actually ended up helping the whole city, economically as well as socially. And this economic frame is something that's been resonating in some of the communities that we've talked to in Australia. But it's the idea that, okay, Nashville actually has a competitive advantage when they're welcoming. So corporations, when they're trying to decide where they're going to resettle in, say they're choosing the Southeast to operate their business, they want their employees to feel welcome. Nissan had moved their headquarters, domestic headquarters to Nashville. They want the spouses of people who are working for them, the kids of the people who are working for them, and then the employees to feel welcome. They need the best people, and so companies started choosing Nashville. And talented people, international people from around the world also were preferring Nashville to other southern cities. And then also immigrant entrepreneurs themselves in Nashville, or other, just people in Nashville were thriving. Newcomers who weren't necessarily thriving as much before, when they didn't feel welcome, when the institutions weren't welcome. And so today, small businesses in Nashville, 30% of small businesses are owned by immigrants and refugees, which is a huge growth from what it was before. And Nashville, in 2013, Nashville had the fastest job growth of any city in the country. And ever since, it's been ever since then, it's been in the top 5, 6, or 7 cities in the country for job growth. So there's something there, and we've done polling of the business community in Nashville, and they feel like this is the welcoming immigrants played an important role. They're not saying it's the only thing, but it played an important role in Nashville's economic renaissance, as well as its social renaissance, as well as being a more united city. It gained economically as well. That was when the English only failed. I got that myself. So this is just some surveying we did of the business community and other leaders in Nashville. This is over 80% believe immigrants have helped Nashville reach a more global audience. That's another side effect of being welcoming. If you have diversity in your community from around the world and they feel welcome, they're more likely to help you make business connections in the countries where they're from. And Nashville's really seen that help its international trade. Innovation, productivity, talk about entrepreneurship. And then this is, we saw the headline from that other magazine before. This is a better headline. This is the news story of Nashville as being a model for the country. And we turned it around using these methods. One other sign that things were going well, President Obama came to Nashville to make a speech about it being a model of integration for the country. And he flew me on his airplane, Air Force One, to go. We went together. Truly, some people don't believe me, but it's true. So that was a special moment for the movement that we were trying to build. What our strategy is, and again, there's a lot of things that we believe are relevant, and some guest speakers will help talk about the relevance to Australia. But one thing that's interesting in the United States that I believe will happen here as well is this idea of a competition, and we call it a race to the top. I've noticed that Sydney and Melbourne are competitive. People are competitive. How do you channel that? How do we channel fear in a good way so they're afraid of not being left behind as opposed to other things? How do we channel human emotions? And humans are competitive. And so our cities are in a friendly competition. So we're now in over 100 cities, New York City, Chicago, but also Nashville and much smaller towns. And this model works in small towns. There's a whole film about work that we did in one small town that was that aired nationally in the United States. But the idea is that if you're surrounded by communities that are doing this work and they're seeing economic gain, it's much more likely that you're going to eventually get on the bus. That's what's been happening in the U.S. So we've been spreading virally. Like one community, Dayton, Ohio, was a community that was losing population. And Tasmania, we've talked to them about having some parallels with Dayton. But Dayton was losing population until they instituted their Welcome Dayton plan, and hired staff, a lot of staff within the municipal government to help lead the Welcome Dayton program. They're now gaining population, so they reversed their population decline, and business, and that's, if you look statistically, it's because of immigrants and refugees. And so Dayton was the first city in Ohio. Now we have 9 cities in Ohio, small cities, large cities, and same thing in Michigan, from 1 community to about 10 communities in Michigan, including large cities like Detroit, which are part of our network. And so eventually we're envisioning a time where we get to a tipping point, where you're just surrounded. If you're surrounded on all sides by communities that are doing this, eventually you feel like you're being left behind if you're not doing it too. And so eventually it'll come to a point where there's a tipping point, and it just, the domino starts to fall. And we've seen that another movement in the United States, the smoking cessation movement, which it's easier to pass these things here than in the US, where the smoking industry has a lot of clout. But the groups that tried to say, okay, let's not have smoking in bars and restaurants in the US or in workplaces, decided to go the bottom up. And it went from 1 community to 4,700 municipalities passing these ordinances. That's 87% of the country covered by those ordinances, and that's sort of the game plan that we're following. And if we had that, we're in 100 communities, if we had that picture on the right there, it would make it much more difficult for kind of negative national things to happen, because you have that infrastructure. I'm not saying that we would have prevented Donald Trump, but I would say that it helps to have that blanket of groups doing, sort of tilling the soil on the local level, creating that infrastructure, and working together. And that's a really important part of what we do, and what we believe should happen here in Australia is actually, like, the communities that are part of our network, what they value most is being part of our network. So like actually getting to connect to all the other communities that are doing this also, and learning from them. And we're starting to connect the dots internationally too. So we're starting from here tonight. Actually, I'm flying to Berlin. Germany is also very interested in our model, and the German government is paying for an exchange program between our cities, several of our cities, and several of their cities. So that we can learn, because there's a lot of great practices in Germany, so it'll be a two-way learning. And the Welcome to Australia group that's hosting Welcome to the Welcome Cities here is actually coming to our conference in late April in Atlanta. And they'll be joined by German cities, they'll be joined by Canadian cities. So it's how do you connect everybody to learn how to do this well, not saying like I know how to do it best or you know how to do it best. But it's a powerful network, and it's a powerful force for change. So I believe that's it. Yeah, there's a website you can look at. So I did want 2 guest speakers to give very short remarks so we can have that context, and then we'll just open it up to questions or conversation or however it goes. So I'd like to start with Khan Pagonis. Did I pronounce that right? Awesome. I know what to do. So Khan has a long experience and history working on these issues, but also working in local government. And he's now a formal consultant and on the governing body of the Welcoming Cities Initiative. And so Khan's just going to really quickly just give a little teeny perspective about it from the local mind. So, yeah.
I'll take a minute or so. I think the value of what we're doing now in Australia through this Scanlon Foundation initiative to invest in local government has great potential. Local government, we've got 560 councils across Australia, and many local councils do great work in settling new migrants and refugees, and great initiatives around social cohesion and the like. But what we don't have in Australia, and what we've had very little investment in from federal and state governments for that matter, is working with local government to create a strategic framework and some impetus for local government as a sector to work in this space of settlement planning, social cohesion and so That sort of partnership which local government needs as a sector, because while we're strong at the municipal level, when you aggregate up to state peaks in New South Wales or Victoria or nationally, local government doesn't have the sort of strength that it has at the municipal level. It is spread very thinly as a national peak and to some extent as a state peak. And so for local government to be able to respond to migrant settlement, social cohesion type issues, as a sector, it needs strong partnerships, and we've struggled to find partners for the local government sector, and this investment by the Scanlon Foundation in the Welcoming Cities model is the first time, to my knowledge, that we've had a significant investment in local government as a sector. And what we're doing, working in consultation with David's Welcoming America group, which we're loosely modelling the Australian Welcoming Cities model on, has the potential to allow local government as a sector to be a player and respond more systemically, more consistently to issues arising around settlement planning, social cohesion and the like. So I suppose what I see as the value in all of this is the potential for local government to develop a more systemic sectoral response to the sorts of issues we've all been involved in. I think that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Con. Appreciate that. And one more special guest, all for the same price, is Dr. Sev Ozdowski, who is a professor at the University of Sydney, the director of the University of Western Sydney Australian Human Rights. Great. Here it says director at University of Western Sydney. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Also the president of the Australian Council for Human Rights Education.
Thank you very much. It's quite much to do with refugees when I was Human Rights Commissioner and wrote a report on children in immigration detention. But in terms of settlement, there are a number of models around the world. Looking in Australia, we basically have a sort of federal model, central model, which links very well to the communities, and we are part of it, but it doesn't involve very much local government. I've just been in Europe addressing a major conference on refugees and multiculturalism, and listened to a very interesting paper about Poland, where basically all settlement is handled through local government. And they are getting quite a number of people coming from Ukraine, but also quite a number of ex-Poles who were in the 19th century, because of various revolutions and insurrections, sent to Siberia, coming back now without Polish language. And the local communities are working in terms of provisions and with accommodation, initial settlement, work, access to community, and the model works very well. But in terms of Australia, I worked in South Australia for 5 years, where I was in charge of development of a regional settlement program. We managed special deal from federal government where we could select our migrants for South Australia. It worked okay. They were given jobs, they were given accommodation. The issue is that after a short time, vast majority of them was leaving for bigger cities, either for better employment opportunities, or simply they had families or communities in Sydney and Melbourne, and they ran away from Adelaide or from other cities of South Australia. So in a way, challenge to your program, at least in Australia context, is how you anchor people so they will become a permanent feature of local economy and local community. That's a lot of thank you.
Thank you. So now I want to open up to questions, but also to, if you have experience of how this is happening on the local level here, we're happy to have comments or questions. So I just want to open it up. Somebody's going to do the first one now, right?
Carmen Santanelli, 23
Could
years.
you introduce who you
Oh,
are?
I'm sorry, Roger Peters. I used to work in Washington for 23 years, and I'm retired here, and I'm volunteering for the Asylum Seekers, sorry, I'm losing my voice, the Asylum Seeker Center. But I noticed a big difference here in the sense that over there seemed to be so much more assimilation, whereas I don't see that here in terms of the big pockets. So I feel that there is a need on a local level
Yeah.
to really get involved.
And it's interesting, there's definitely, the phenomenon happens around the world, it certainly happens in the United States too. But the people in Melbourne were saying how, when I got to Sydney, it might be a little more ethnically kind of like, segregated is a loaded word, but you know what I mean. And I have seen, I've noticed the difference even between Melbourne and Sydney in that way, but it depends in the U.S. too. But yeah, it's something that communities where that's happening in the U.S. have come to us. And if you create opportunities, you know, for connecting to the broader community and the opportunities that brings, just the political capital of connecting to business leaders and other people outside of kind of the zone that you're in, it tends to help people move out. And then, you know, everybody comes to it. Lots of people come to a community in their first generation. The question is, are they staying in a zone in the second generation or the third generation? If it's the third generation, that can be problematic.
And I'm not using Washington as an example.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
It's a no-no, I mean, having traveled around.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. I just wanted to ask a question. Oh, sorry, yes,
Yeah,
introduce myself.
sorry.
Sorry. I'm Sarah. I go to the law school here. I'm also, I work in refugee resettlement and advocacy, both at a grassroots level and sort of at the top line as well. I wanted to ask you, you touched upon the attractions for councils and for governments as to why they would be more welcoming in the sense that, you know, more networks, competitive advantage, etc. But what are some of the actual examples in terms of successful examples of being welcoming on the grassroots level? So whether they're projects, whether, you know, you mentioned business, for example, is one way. So could you just expand a little bit on that?
So examples of where the welcoming has.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so welcoming as a kind of like a framework, but then actually taking place like with different communities, whether within the business. So how have people participated in actually being more welcoming? What's the criteria? What is a successful welcoming look like?
Culturally or institutionally?
Probably more, I think, institutionally. I mean, in terms of, as I said, examples as to how I'm a business, I want to be more welcoming. What is it that I need to be doing to sort of satisfy that? Or am I, you know, creating projects for refugees that are therefore, you know, considered welcoming?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. And there's lots of examples. Honestly, like we started working with municipal governments and working with entire communities and working on the institutional welcoming in 2012. And the first initiative, you know, Nashville was 2006, but Welcome Dayton was 2011. And so there's still, the results are still starting to trickle in on you know, exactly how it's playing out in every single part of, you know, all 100 communities. But there's like, just on the example of local government, I'll give a local government example, but there are other examples. Right now, local government is more leading the charge because in the United States, on the local level, there wasn't much of an infrastructure even for that. And so you got to start there often and then move into, okay, so what can all the businesses do? But like Nashville, for example, they created a program called My City Academy, which is a part of their sort of larger welcoming frame. But any immigrant, refugee in Nashville can participate in it, and it's a program it's like a leadership development program, basically. But when people, and it's in the community, but all the different agencies of the government come to the community and talk to the people who are part of that program, so you can understand how the community works better. Politicians come and explain like how you can get involved in the political process. And so a program like that is helpful in that I mean, again, that's not trying to make Nashvillians more welcoming, it's trying to introduce the immigrant community, but it's resulted, you know, in more people in the immigrant community becoming involved in boards and commissions, but also even running for office. And so, yeah, there's lots of examples of municipal government more than the other. I mean, right now, a big business role is just building the support to actually make it happen. And so an example of that is in Atlanta, you know, whatever your opinions are about the Coke company, it's a big industry, it's a big company in Atlanta. It was founded in Atlanta, still based there. And Coke understood that, yeah, I mean, the Georgia legislature was passing some bills that were not very good on immigration, or immigrant multiculturalism. And so that was a problem for the brand of Atlanta, and they needed to be able to attract, again, people from around the world to Coke. And so for them, they're like, well, of course we need to support welcoming Atlanta because we need to make sure that Atlanta's positioned as a global city, as a welcoming city. So later on, we'd like to get Coke to start looking at their workplace policies, and they actually, part of the Welcoming Atlanta plan called for, because we're doing, I should have mentioned this, and this is something that is going to happen here too. We're developing certification for communities, like credentialing, so that you can, it's got to be flexible credentialing because every community is different. But so that it's not just, we're welcoming, but this is what you need to do to be welcoming. And so that credentialing will, it's a long process to get there because you have to build the buy-in of everybody in the field, really. But that will help spur this competition. But it also, it's important to have that credentialing. But in Atlanta, they talked about in the plan also doing certification for businesses. And we'd like to see certification for schools eventually as well around welcoming. If you can prove that there's a value proposition, if the school's going to have better outcomes or whatever that value proposition is, corporations can be able to attract more people, then the certification is a no-brainer. And then they're going to do what you want them to do.
Yeah, I'll just bring, how are you funded?
We're funded primarily, there's a lot more foundations, private foundations in the United States than anywhere else in the world, and certainly than in Australia. And so, we get a lot of our funding from private foundations, and with different sort of desires. Like there's foundations that are interested in social cohesion, but others that are interested in just like supporting innovations in cities, or even social entrepreneurship fund, or So, but also we get money from the federal government. We get some money from businesses, from individuals. So,
And it's a secular organisation?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have programs that run in institutions like schools and universities?
Not yet. I mean, we've been approached by universities too, as this growing diversity is coming into international students in universities. There's also, I mean, I don't need to tell anyone, but there can be challenges as well. And people can, from other countries, like in the United States, there's been a large influx of Chinese international students into universities, and that's helping financially. But those students aren't necessarily always integrating as much, and so. But that's not. I mean, that's a two-way street. Why that might be happening. So how do you build a welcoming institution? How do you create the welcoming institutions and the conversations, and what else do you do to kind of get past that? So yeah, more to come. But right now we do work with definitely work with schools, for example, because you can't work in a community and not work with schools. It's the epicenter of the community. It's where immigrant integration happens more than anywhere else. And so schools are always on the planning committees for welcoming, for welcoming, and you can't be a welcoming city if you're not focused on making sure your schools are inclusive. But school certification, I think, will come later.
Can I ask you, who are the main beneficiaries of your program in Nashville? And really what I'm trying to find out is, are you focusing on individuals, on individual families, or are you looking after whole groups of people coming from particular countries or backgrounds?
We're definitely, I mean, yeah, people ask me that, like, when I say what I do, they're like, oh, okay, so you resettle refugees, individual refugees, but that's not our goal. And in Atlanta, for example, there were plenty of groups that were doing the individual services, but they were, the refugee groups weren't collaborating with the local government, wasn't collaborating even with the groups that were working with immigrants. And so we're trying to create that web of support so that you see better outcomes for whole groups, not just for 1, 2, 3 individuals. Does that make sense? Like, we'd like to see better outcomes for again, we want to see these we want to make sure that Nashville is better off for everyone, but we also want to make sure that that the Kurdish community in general is having, over time, is having better outcomes, and that the Mexican community is having better outcomes, not just individuals in the Mexican community or the Kurdish community.
You see, my question resulted from the person mentioning who resides in Washington, D.C., and mentioned the assimilation work. And in a way, if you take one family or one person, it will be much easier to incorporate that person or into a community. If you take a larger community, say 50 families, it will be totally different social mechanism. And in a way, it's what I'm interested in here, how you manage that.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's we could talk for 3 days about that, and you're driving to the airport, so but I mean, I would say that we're building the capacity of the organizations that are working within, now the city is supporting, the city didn't have, Atlanta, for example, didn't have an office of immigrant affairs before this work, and they were just kind of doing it ad hoc. And so the organizations that are doing the individual services now are getting more support from the city, more support from the different. So in a way, we're supporting the individual, but it's a complicated question, and we can get into it. But I understand the nuance, and I look forward to talking about it more. It's not a simple answer, but it's a good question. Actually, let's let somebody do that in Nashville, and then we'll go back to you.
The initiatives or programs run in those particular cities or local governments, are they applying for funding to develop those projects, or is it auspiced by welcoming organization? Is it auspiced through you, or do they have the opportunity to apply? You're guiding them through that, and they get that funding, and therefore they can continue with service throughout.
So all of the service organizations?
Particularly where you started from in Nashville, and currently, is that how it's working?
So it's, we're not providing funding to the collaboratives. It's very grassroots. So local, like in Atlanta, the Atlanta Community Foundation is on the planning committee. They have connections to all sorts of other funders. And so the idea is how can the local community fund what, if you're going to create this web of welcoming and organizations play a role in that, how can the city government fund that more strategically and better? How can community foundations and other foundations fund that better? So our job is to help. And we also help them connect, we're working with the White House, for example, on it's called the Building Welcoming Communities campaign. We're the partner with them on that. So yeah, it wasn't just the flying the plane, we're actually working with them. But what they're trying to do is leverage federal resources, federal resources to support these local communities. And so we're trying to sort of, pry out some money from the federal government or other services that they provide that will then flow also to these communities. So yeah, we're not, the money's not coming from us, but we're making it flow from other places.
You said that you get funding, your organization gets funding from the federal funding. What's the statistic that is the percentage vis-a-vis the rest of it? And the second question related to that is how did you, was there a challenge and how did you get the funding from the federal government or get them to see what you were doing?
Those are great questions. I'm trying to put, not the best at math, it's probably about 8%. 8% of our funding is 10% of our funding from the federal government. Probably a little bit less than 10. But anyway, it's not a huge percentage. And for the federal government to notice us, this is interesting. So part of the reason why the refugee resettlement, the Office of Refugee Resettlement is our main funder for the federal government. And they were very focused on the seed-based approach. But then all of a sudden there were communities that were starting to have a backlash, not just Nashville, all in different pockets of the U.S. And they were like, we're only trained to help our service providers provide services, but those services are only going to go so far if people don't want refugees to be in their community. And so they found out about the work that we did through a bunch of different networks, but we're the only one that did that. And we had worked with other entities, we had the legitimacy, and so they said, let's make you they have this technical assistance grant, provider grant, and so we're the official welcoming technical assistance provider for the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So that's just yeah, the federal government in general is starting to wake up to this, like through the Building Welcoming Communities campaign, also this idea that you need to focus on the soil, you need to have full infrastructure, the economic development, all these things is just starting to click. And was there another question too?
Well, that was, the challenge to get ready with
okay.
that.
Yeah, everything's big country.
I'm wondering, you mentioned at the start when you were talking about Nashville that politicians in the area began to see negative language as being politically profitable. I'm wondering was that an obstacle for your work, or did you tackle it head on, or how did you circumvent that?
Sure. And of course it was an obstacle to work. Yeah, I mean, at the time, when the things were going really south, really badly, and politicians were starting to really move in, we realized that we if you think of a community as being on a welcoming spectrum, so there's a community that might be fearful or hostile, tolerant, and then actively welcoming. And depending on where you're, and it's a simplification because obviously every community is not monolithic, but Nashville is on the far side of the hostile. And when you're in that environment, and by the way, tolerant, I like to say this, tolerant is not enough. Like, I don't want to be tolerated by people. I want, when my first day of school for my kid next year, or one of my kids, I want them to be welcomed by the community, not tolerated by the community. And so tolerance means all these moving into the actively welcoming institutions and culture. But Nashville is on this side, and so the municipal government frankly wasn't ready to work with it. It was too toxic of an environment. They didn't really want to talk to us that much, or they weren't ready to. They talked to us, and some of the members of the council were on that welcoming committee, but they weren't ready to really put everything forward. And so that was why that receiving communities work, the three-pronged approach that I talked about before, was so important, because we built such a strong coalition of people and started to change the culture of the community, so that once we had gotten to the tolerant place, then we could engage the municipal government to take it much, much further. And that's often the case. If it's a really toxic environment, you can't pretend that you can just move forward in the same way as if it's a place that's kind of doing pretty well. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, on the language, so
Sorry, I got the next.
are you finding that as your communities grow and you get more and more instances where it's more and more successful, are you finding that negative language is changing to a much more positive? And then if so, what kind do you think that would branch up as high as changing national policy in the way it's talked about?
I do. Yeah, and a lot of groups that are. I mean, first of all, that slide that I showed of the tipping point. Like, if you had all those, if you really were covering the entire nation and welcoming communities that were, and that builds an infrastructure, which is helpful when bad things happen, but also it can move forward. Yeah, it can start to move forward a policy agenda. And a lot of our groups are doing that on a state level now. There's enough, like in Ohio and Michigan, there's enough groups on the local level, but that now they're moving a state policy agenda. And the governor of Michigan, who's Republican, is trying to position Michigan as the most welcoming state in the country and has all these programs. So it's filtering its way up. But yeah, as far as the narrative, the message piece, the idea that cities are competing with each other to be welcoming, like the underlying message there is that immigrants and refugees are an asset, and that cities are actually willing to compete for that asset. And that's a powerful message. It's very different than the sort of, again, I'm not going to mention his name again. He who shall not be named. But yeah, like that message is that foreigners are a threat and that they're a liability. And so a lot, yeah, as you start to work towards the national agenda, to be able to say, well, actually, in real communities, this isn't just theoretical. In real communities, so this community has gained this much. So look, it's an asset. This is good for our country. So it does help feed into a national narrative, and it has, especially in the Rust Belt, I would say where we have the largest concentration, it has started to change the narrative of in general in that region. So, yeah.
Margaret Maliotis, I'm from
Thank you for, yeah, I've been not remembering the issue. Thank you.
an organisation called Scanlon Foundation International that serves refugees in South France. Sorry we came in a bit late, but my understanding from what you were saying, I had 2 or 3 questions around Firstly, are you going to be evaluating the program, or have you evaluated? I ask that because what we see, for example, in New South Wales more recently, and I think those in the room who understand the politics around refugee and asylum seekers in Australia, I guess it's in Europe, is that it's a very political area. And once politicians at all levels of government are involved, quite often the agenda can be skewed. And in New South Wales, we have leadership at the state level that is very engaged and very keen to look at integration as a two-way thing. So actually saying, we need to make some systemic changes. And I guess my concern is Australia has a very vibrant civil society, and a lot of NGOs, a lot of schools and unions and faith organisations come together and play a very important role in welcoming. And they do that every day in many different ways. And that quite often is not valued, or not, what happens at the community level does not match the narrative, which is very negative. So how do you ensure that, through local government, that the best interests of community and the best partnerships are coordinated and engaged? Because I think a lot of it has to do with good coordination of things that are already happening and things already on road.
Yeah, and I agree. I got to remember to answer the evaluation part, but I'll start with this first part. I mean, in general, civil society organizations really like this work, and it adds value for them. And I gave the example of Atlanta, where all these different groups were doing individual work, but they weren't working together. And so this was not, and sometimes kind of messaging in ways that weren't helpful for each other. But when the mayor said we're going to make this city the most welcoming city in the southeast, and please come to the table and help us figure out how to do that. They felt empowered by that, and they knew, because they're already doing it. But it wasn't as coordinated. It wasn't connecting to these other institutions. So they value it. In general, I can't think of an example where groups haven't seen it as a value add, and it's bringing in more. It brings in more resources. It lifts up their stories of success. So yeah, that's that has to be done with the work here too. If you come into a new community, you don't say, we know how to do this, like do this. You bring people together and say, we know you know how to do this. We've been doing this. Want to do it? So can we create a plan together to do it even more unified, in a more unified way? Around evaluation, certification and standards itself is a form of evaluation. If you create good enough standards, and the city has to get to a certain point to be certified, and so that's one level of it. And another value of the standards is right now we do evaluation of individual communities. It's hard to evaluate the group as a whole because there's no standard that says what welcoming is. And so once people are kind of more on the same page about what it means, even though we have a framework, so it's not that they're on a totally different page, but it'll be easier to do a field-wide evaluation of the work. But already, we have plenty of individual instances, and all the communities we work in are in order to get the support locally that they need, they have to do it. So they're helping us develop it. But it's going to be important, obviously, here as well. Last chance.
Well, look, David, thank you so much for such an engaging speech, not speech so much as interaction with the audience and the insights that you have shared with us. When I heard David speak in Davos, I was struck by just how positive a message it was that he was presenting. I think so often when we're working in this area, I shouldn't probably say particularly in Australia, but we know what the political environment is like in Australia. It's all too easy to be quite despairing about the outlook, and yet I think what David is showing is that communities can make a difference, that policy change is achievable, and that through these incremental steps we can actually make the day-to-day life of immigrants and refugees all the better, and hopefully over time that does translate into more structural change. So David, thank you very, very much.
Can I say one more thing? Which is that if you want to connect to the Welcoming Australia work, should we have them contact you, Don, or the people that...
Yes,
Yeah.
people can contact me, but I think Arlene is probably.
Actually, there's a Welcoming Cities Australia website now. I should have brought that. Yeah, I'll look for the link. Google knows it already. But yeah, you can sign up to get involved through the website now. Yeah.
Perhaps we should just clarify that while Scanlon Foundation is investing in this initiative, they're doing it primarily through the organisation that David mentioned, which is Welcome to Australia. And they recently appointed a national project manager, Ali Marley, based in Brisbane. And I think he would be probably the best first point of contact for anyone wanting to find out more. But I'm very happy to facilitate introducing people or connecting them with others.
And yeah, if nothing else, you can go to the Welcome to Australia website. That'll connect you to the Welcoming Cities website. If you can't, just straight through the
Thank you very much. And also thank you to Con and to Seb for your comments as well. That really helped, and hopefully we can see this start to take off in Australia in the same way that has happened.
I think go faster because you guys are more welcoming than we are.
Thank you so